We return to our top story. The fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas on the verge of collapse after Israeli airstrikes pounded Gaza, killing at this point more than 400 people. More, we're joined by Jean-Loup Samaan. He's a senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Samaan. Just 10 minutes ago, the British government calling on Israel and Hamas to implement their ceasefire agreement for Gaza, quote, in full, suggesting that at least in part that agreement still stands. But if we're looking at attacks which just overnight have killed at this point more than 400 people, is there any value to a ceasefire, even in name?
Well, I think everyone right now is hoping that it's still possible to go back to the context of the ceasefire. The problem is that we've seen over the last weeks that there were already a lot of uncertainties, disagreements between Hamas and Israel with regards to the future of the ceasefire. The question was regarding the phase 2 of the ceasefire that Israel was reluctant to implement, and then you had several proposals from the US, from the Qataris, that failed so far. So what we saw is Israel using, let's say, the military option to force Hamas to go back to the ceasefire, even though Israel had already decided not to go with the second step of the initial agreement of the ceasefire.
All right, you're talking about signals out in the last few weeks suggesting that Israel and Hamas were never going to go to phase 2 of the agreement. With hindsight now, they look like signals. But for anyone who suggests in January, on the 19th of January, when the first phase went into effect, that this ceasefire was not going to last, did you think at that point it would actually go into phase 2 and phase 3?
Well, it's always easier in hindsight to say that the ceasefire was going to fail, whatever happened. But what we knew from the beginning is that it's easier in the first phase, when it's mostly about stopping the clash and focusing on the release of the hostages. Phase 2 from the beginning was when you start working on the long-term political conditions with regards to the reconstruction of Gaza, the disengagement of the Israel Defense Forces from the Gaza Strip. And that's where, for instance, in Israel, this leads to very contentious issues with regards to the coalition in government. And the far-right members of that coalition made it clear that if Netanyahu, the prime minister, was to implement those conditions, this would mean the end of the coalition. So for sure, there were elements that were predictable, but there were also, at least in the international community, hopes that both sides would come to the conclusion that it is still worth going forward, that it's not good for anyone to go back to the war. But for sure, there shouldn't be any surprise that we are back to the logic of war.
Apart from a fundamental disagreement over issues such as how to resolve, find a permanent end to this war, what we have also seen in the last few weeks is solidarity between Washington and Tel Aviv on what's happening in Gaza. Mr. Trump might be more divided when it comes to on Ukraine or Canada, Mexico, the European Union, but on Israel, he has been unqualified in his support for Israel. And that is something Israel could have drawn strength on. We saw weekend attacks on Houthi rebels in Yemen. So Israel, it might have been less certain on the 19th of January. It is more certain now that it has full backing from Washington should it want to return to, I suppose, a fuller war in Gaza.
Yes, for sure. There is right now clear coordination. The Israeli strikes this last 24 hours were approved and were at least started with the go-ahead from Washington. There is clear also indication that this comes after the intensification, the escalation from the Trump administration with regards to the Red Sea and the Houthis in Yemen. Having said that, that doesn't mean that the Trump administration is completely 100% behind the government of Netanyahu. We've seen over the last weeks that there are some issues with regards to how the U.S. also wants to engage directly with Hamas. The Trump administration did that in the past weeks. But the fact that Hamas didn't comply with the U.S. demands, at the end of the day, the Trump administration considers it has the upper hand with regards to the Gaza Strip. So clearly, they are on board with this escalation. This goes ahead with the Trump statements in the past that Hamas should comply, or it will experience hell. That is what we've seen over the last 24 hours on Gaza, unfortunately.
Thanks for that. Dr. Jean-Loup Samaan, Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore.